She was 24 when Ryan Hollis filed for divorce. He did not tell her in person. There was no difficult conversation, no tearful reckoning over a dinner table. There was only a manila envelope on the polished granite of their kitchen island, stark and official against the gleaming surface. Her name was on it, typed in a crisp, impersonal font. He had been methodical. He had been efficient. He took the money from their joint account, every last cent, a clean digital transfer that left a balance of 0.00. He took the art from the walls, leaving pale, ghostly rectangles where the abstract canvases had hung. He took the Danish mid-century furniture, the Italian leather sofa, the Persian rug they had bought on their honeymoon. He took the German knives from their magnetic strip on the wall and the French cookware from its overhead rack. He took everything that had a name, a brand, a quantifiable and easily appraised value. He had secured the lease on the apartment in his name alone. He left her with her clothes, her books on pollinator ecology, and a single framed photograph of her grandmother. He had never asked about her grandmother, not really. He had certainly never asked about the dilapidated Beekeeper's barn on a forgotten plot of land in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York that her grandmother, Despina, had left to her in a quietly probated will years ago. He did not know it existed. She had grown up understanding the hum of bees the way some children grow up understanding silence. It was not an absence of noise to her, but a presence, a language of frequency and intent that spoke of nectar flows and weather fronts, of colony health and communal purpose. It was the background radiation of her childhood summers, a resonant thrum that vibrated up from the soles of her feet when she stood in the fields near her Yaya Despina's apiary. This understanding was a form of inheritance long before any property was involved. It was a knowledge seeded in her cells, a particular quality of attention passed down through 3 generations of Greek-American beekeepers. Her great-grandfather, Giannis Papadakis, had brought the knowledge with him from the slopes of Mount Taygetus, a place where honey was thick as myth and tasted of thyme and wild oregano. He had arrived in America with his wife, Despina, carrying little more than a single battered suitcase and a deep, abiding comprehension of Apis mellifera. He saw the rolling hills and clover-choked fields of the Finger Lakes and recognized a landscape that could speak the same language as his bees. They had started with nothing, Giannis and Despina. They bought a small, neglected parcel of land with a loan from a cousin, land that others dismissed as too steep for corn and too stony for grapes. But Giannis saw the wild apple blossoms in the spring, the dense stands of basswood and black locust, the late-season blaze of goldenrod and aster. He saw a paradise for pollinators. Together they built the first hives by hand, the scent of freshly sawn pine mingling with the rich aroma of Despina's coffee. He was the quiet architect of the operation, a man whose hands were deft and gentle, who could calm a nervous swarm with a low murmur and the slow, deliberate grace of his movements. Despina was its heart and its mind. She learned the botany of their new home with a fierce, scholarly intensity, creating a bloom calendar that allowed them to follow the nectar flow from the first thaw of March to the last hard frost of October. She was the one who managed the books, who found the buyers at farmers' markets, who built a reputation for Papadakis honey that was as pure and unassailable as the product itself. They had 5 good years, 5 years of shared labor under the wide New York sky, of building a life frame by frame, just as their bees built their combs cell by cell. Then, a logging accident on a neighbor's property took Giannis, suddenly and senselessly, leaving Despina a widow at 32 with a 5-year-old son, Lena's father, and an apiary of 50 hives. The community expected her to fail. They expected her to sell the land, take her son, and move to the city to find work in a factory or a diner. It was what a sensible woman would do. But Despina's resilience was a quiet, formidable thing, like the stone foundations of the barn Giannis had just finished building. She did not sell. She did not leave. She mourned her husband with a grief so profound it seemed to bleach the very color from her eyes, and then she put on his old canvas hat, fired up the smoker, and went to work. She took the knowledge they had shared and refined it. She took the business they had started and expanded it. She became not just a beekeeper, but a master of her craft, a local legend whose wisdom was sought by university researchers and struggling vintners alike. She ran the apiary alone for 40 years, her hands growing calloused and her face lined by the sun and the wind, her quiet competence becoming a landmark in the region. The barn was her sanctuary. It was where she extracted the honey, the air growing thick and sweet with its scent, the gleaming copper tank of the extractor catching the light. It was where she rendered the beeswax into candles and salves, where she repaired the wooden supers, where she sat in the quiet evenings, listening to the hum of the hives settling for the night, a sound that was, for her, the sound of survival, of continuance. Lena had spent every summer of her childhood in that barn, in that field. While other children went to summer camp, she went to her yayas. She learned to read the flight patterns of foraging bees, to distinguish the light, floral notes of clover honey from the dark, woodsy taste of buckwheat. Despina taught her not with lectures, but with quiet demonstration. She taught her the patience of waiting for a queen to emerge, the precision of grafting larvae to raise new queens, the courage of standing bare-handed and calm in a swirling cloud of thousands of bees. Lena learned the specific way her grandmother's hands moved, with an economy and certainty that was mesmerizing. She learned the particular quality of the silence between them, a comfortable space filled with shared understanding and the thrumming of the hives. It was in those summers that the foundation of Lena's own life's work was laid. She didn't just love the bees, she understood their vital, intricate role in the world. She saw them not as producers of a commodity, but as the architects of ecosystems, the tiny, tireless engines of biodiversity. This understanding led her to her degree in biology, to her postgraduate research on native pollinator decline. Her work was a direct continuation of Despina's legacy, translated into the language of science. Then she met Ryan. She met him in a university library, a place of quiet and study that felt, at first, like a shared habitat. He was a graduate student in architecture and real estate development, and he was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened. He asked questions about her research, his brow furrowed with what she mistook for genuine interest. He called her work beautiful and important. He was charming, ambitious, and he painted a picture of a future that was as sleek and well-designed as one of his architectural renderings. They married a year after graduation. The failure of their marriage was a slow, quiet process of erasure. Ryan's interest in her work, she came to realize, was purely aesthetic. He liked the idea of being married to a scientist, a woman doing something noble and earthy. It added a certain texture to his own life, which was increasingly consumed with acquisitions, mergers, and property values. He didn't want to hear about the complexities of colony collapse disorder or the subtle indicators of neonicotinoid poisoning. He wanted the sanitized, romantic version. He encouraged her to take a break from her research to focus on their home, on building their life. He saw her passion not as a career, but as a quaint hobby that could be picked up and put down. He never understood that for Lena, the bees were not a hobby. They were a lens through which she understood the world. He was a man who kept score. He remembered every favor, every compromise, every time he paid for dinner. His love was transactional. He saw their life together as a joint venture. And when he decided it was no longer profitable, he liquidated the assets with the same cool detachment he would apply to an underperforming commercial property. He never asked about her family because he saw no value in a history that couldn't be leveraged. He heard the stories of her grandmother as charming anecdotes, not as the foundational text of the woman he claimed to love. He could not see her true worth because he had no tools to measure it. The bus ride upstate was a long, humming meditation. Lena sat with her forehead pressed against the cool glass, watching the concrete towers of the city bleed into sprawling suburbs, then into the rolling green hills and patchwork farms of the countryside. She had less than $300 in her wallet, a single suitcase filled with her most practical clothes, and her worn leather field bag containing her research journals and the framed photo of Despina. With every mile that passed, the tight, cold knot of shock and betrayal in her chest seemed to loosen, replaced by a quiet, uncertain emptiness. The bus engine droned on, a pale imitation of the sound she was traveling toward, the sound of home. She got off in a small town that hugged the northern shore of one of the long, slender lakes. The air smelled different here, of damp earth, cut grass, and the faint, sweet perfume of clover. It was the scent of her childhood. Her first stop was the office of Thompson & Sons, attorneys at law. The firm was housed in a red brick building on the town's main street, its windows adorned with gold leaf lettering. Mr. Thompson was the son, a man now in his late 70s with kind, watery eyes and a handshake as firm as his father's had been. He had been the executor of Despina's will. He remembered Lena as a little girl with scraped knees and honey-sticky fingers. He sat her down in his office, which smelled of old paper and leather, and expressed his condolences for her grandmother's passing years ago, and then, with a gentle, knowing look for whatever trouble had brought her here now. He didn't press for details. Instead, he opened a large, heavy safe and retrieved a thick vellum envelope. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice soft. "She foresaw a great deal. She wanted to make sure this would always be here for you, a place to stand if the ground ever gave way beneath you." He pushed the deed across the polished mahogany desk. It was all in her name, clean and clear. Then he handed her the key. It was not a modern key. It was heavy, made of black iron, with an ornate clover-shaped head and a long, complicated bit. It felt less like a key and more like an artifact, a piece of a story. Lena clutched it in her hand, the cold metal a tangible link to her past, a solid fact in a world that had just become terrifyingly abstract. She walked the last mile to the property, the suitcase bumping against her leg. The gravel road was flanked by overgrown Queen Anne's lace and chicory. Then she saw it. The barn stood at the crest of a small hill, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. It was just as she remembered it, only more weathered, more tired. The gray paint was peeling in long strips, revealing the dark, aged wood beneath. A thick mane of ivy had climbed one wall, obscuring a window. The fields around it were a riot of weeds and wildflowers, no longer the neatly managed rows of her grandmother's time. It looked forsaken. But the foundation of hand-laid fieldstone was solid. The steep pitch of the metal roof, though streaked with rust, was straight and true. It had what her grandmother used to call kala kokala, good bones. It was a place built to last. The air was alive with the sound of insects, a wild, chaotic symphony compared to the organized hum of Despina's apiary. Yet, underneath it all, Lena could feel the deep, resonant silence of the place, a silence that held memories. The iron key turned in the lock with a groan of protest, the sound of long disuse. The heavy door swung inward on complaining hinges, and Lena stepped out of the bright sun and into the cool, dusty dark. For a moment, she could see nothing, but she could smell it. The scent was immediate, overwhelming, a complex perfume that bypassed her mind and went straight to her memory. It smelled of old wood, of propolis and beeswax, a resinous, spicy scent that was the very essence of a hive. It smelled of dried herbs. Despina had always hung bunches of lavender and mint from the rafters, and beneath it all the faint, phantom sweetness of a million bygone honey harvests. As her eyes adjusted, the vast interior of the barn resolved itself from the shadows. Sunlight streamed in through the high, dirt-streaked windows, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes. The main floor was dominated by the old extracting equipment. The large, cylindrical copper tank of the extractor stood in the center of the room, its surface dull with a patina of age. Nearby was the uncapping tank, the wax melter, and stacks of empty wooden supers, their corners dovetailed with a craftsman's precision. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of dust, shrouded in cobwebs. It looked like a museum exhibit left to decay. Lena walked through the space, her footsteps echoing in the cathedral-like silence. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool surface of the copper tank, tracing the dents and scratches, each one a mark from a summer past. She climbed the sturdy ladder to the loft where she used to sleep on a simple cot, listening to the rain on the metal roof. It was all still here. Everything that mattered was still here. She remembered a conversation from the summer she was 16. She had been helping Despina clean the extracting equipment after the final harvest. Her grandmother, usually taciturn, had been in a reflective mood. "This barn, this land," Despina had said, her voice low as she polished the copper tank. "It is more than just a place. It is a bank, not for money, Agapimu, but for a way of life. You must always know how to find what is most valuable." She had then tapped a particular floorboard beneath the heavy platform that held the extractor. Some things must be kept safe, for the winter, for the hard times. Lena had thought it was a metaphor. Now, kneeling on the dusty floor, she knew it wasn't. She found the board her grandmother had indicated. It looked no different from the others, but when she pressed on the edge, it gave slightly. Using the tip of a hive tool she found on a nearby shelf, she pried it up. Beneath it lay a dark, square void. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against the rough surface of wood. She pulled, and with a grunt of effort, she lifted a heavy, sealed honey crate into the light. The lid was held down, not with nails, but with a thick, amber-colored seal of beeswax. It was Despina's signature, a beekeeper's lock. Lena broke the seal with the hive tool. The scent of old wax and dry paper wafted up. The crate was filled to the brim. On top were thick bundles of cash, old bills held together with faded rubber bands. Beneath them, nestled in soft cloth, were dozens of gold coins, heavy and cool to the touch. Canadian maple leafs, South African Krugerrands, American eagles. Lena sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. She carefully lifted everything out and began to count. The cash alone was over $30,000. The coins, she estimated, were worth at least another 15. It was not a fortune in Ryan's world, but in hers, it was a kingdom. It was enough. It was enough to begin again. At the very bottom of the crate, lying on a piece of velvet, was a letter. The envelope was addressed to her, Elenitsa Mu, in her grandmother's elegant, looping script, a mixture of Greek and English characters. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter began in Greek. "My dearest Lena, if you are reading this, then the ground has given way, as I feared it one day might. Do not despair. A woman of our line does not break easily. We are like the bees. We may lose a queen, we may face a long winter, but the colony survives. The work continues." The letter then switched to English, the writing clear and practical. "The money is for the barn. Do not be frugal with the bones of this place. The roof is its soul. Find Elias Petru, the roofer in town. His father worked with your grandfather. His family is honest. Tell him you are my granddaughter. He will understand. The rest is for the bees. They will need new hives, new queens. Start small. Let them teach you the land again. And some is for you, to eat, to be warm, to remember that you are worthy of care." The final paragraph returned to Greek and to philosophy. "That man you married, I saw him only once at your wedding. I saw the way he looked at things, but not into them. He is a man who counts. He does not weigh. He will never understand that the true value of this place is not in the acreage or the structure, but in the work that it represents. It is a legacy of resilience. It is the quiet promise that after every winter, there is a spring. This is your inheritance, my love. Not the money, not the barn, the resilience. Now, get to work. Your Yaya Despina. Lena held the letter to her chest and wept. She cried for her grandmother, for the marriage she had lost, and for the profound, anchoring relief of being seen, of being known so completely by someone who was no longer there. The tears were not of sorrow, but of catharsis. When she was done, she wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and stood up. She had work to do. The next morning, she found Elias Petro's business in the phone book. An older woman answered, and when Lena explained who she was, there was a warm exclamation on the other end of the line. An hour later, a dusty pickup truck rumbled up the drive. Elias Petro was a man in his late 60s with a sun-weathered face and hands as gnarled as oak branches. He got out of the truck and looked at the barn, then at Lena, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Papadakis," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll be damned. You have your grandmother's eyes." He walked the perimeter of the barn, his gaze expert and assessing. He climbed a ladder to inspect the roof, tapping the metal, checking the seams. When he came down, he nodded slowly. "Good bones," he said, echoing Lena's own thoughts. "Your grandfather and my father built this to last. The roof is mostly sound, just some rust and a few loose seams near the ridge cap. We can patch it, seal it, give it another 20 years easy." He quoted her a price that was startlingly fair. Lena knew from her brief time with Ryan that contractors often inflated their initial quotes. "It's a good price, Mr. Petro," she said. "It is the price I would have given your grandmother," he replied, as if that were the only explanation necessary. His two sons arrived the next day, both of them strong, quiet men who moved with an easy competence. Lena didn't just watch them work. She was there at dawn, coffee in hand for them. She helped clear the debris, hauled buckets of sealant, learned to use a wire brush to scour the rust from the metal panels. She absorbed the rhythm of the work, the scrape of metal on metal, the smell of the hot tar sealant, the satisfaction of seeing a rusted seam become a clean, weatherproof line. The physical labor was a balm. It left no room in her mind for recrimination or self-pity. Her muscles ached at the end of the day, a deep, honest soreness that felt like an achievement. Elias would stop by each afternoon to inspect the progress, often bringing stories of Despina. He told Lena how her grandmother had faced down a banker who wanted to foreclose on her loan, how she had once driven a truckload of her hives all the way to Maine to pollinate a blueberry crop when money was tight. "She was a queen, that one," he said, looking at the barn with reverence. "This whole valley knew it." When the work was done, the roof gleamed under the sun, solid and secure. Lena paid Elias in cash and he wrote her a receipt on a slip of paper. As he was about to leave, he paused. "Your Yia," he said. "She made this place. It's good to see it in the hands of someone who will honor it." With the barn secure from the weather, Lena turned her attention to the interior. The work became a daily ritual, a slow and methodical reclamation. She started by sweeping away the years of dust and cobwebs, a task that took 3 full days. She filled bucket after bucket with hot, soapy water and scrubbed the thick wooden floorboards on her hands and knees, watching the pale grain of the pine emerge from beneath the grime. The water turned black. She scrubbed until it ran clear. She tackled the great copper extractor next, using a mixture of vinegar and salt, just as Despina had taught her. She polished the dull, greenish metal in slow, circular motions, her own reflection gradually appearing on its surface, distorted and faint at first, then sharpening into clarity as the copper began to shine with its original fiery brilliance. It was a mirror of her own journey. Each task was an act of devotion. She reglazed the windows, carefully cutting the new panes of glass, pressing them into the soft putty. She cleaned and oiled the old hand-cranked honey pump. She sanded and refinished the long wooden workbenches, the scent of linseed oil filling the air. She was not renovating the space. She was not trying to turn it into something it wasn't. She was simply waking it up, tending to it, bringing it back to life. She set up a small Spartan living area for herself in the loft, with a cot, a small table, and the single-framed photograph of Despina. The main floor became her laboratory and her workshop. She didn't buy new furniture. She used the existing benches and tables, the sturdy, functional pieces her grandparents had built. The barn was not just her home, it was her partner in this new life, a silent, steady collaborator. As the weeks passed, the space transformed. The air cleared, the light grew brighter, the barn began to breathe again. And so did Lena. The money from Despina's cash was for rebuilding, a sacred trust she refused to spend on daily expenses. She needed a job. She saw a posting on the community board at the local library for a part-time research assistant at the Cornell Cooperative Extension Office. The position involved field work, data collection, and lab analysis for a long-term study on native pollinator populations in the Finger Lakes agricultural region. It was her field, her passion. It felt too perfect to be possible. She sent in her resume, not expecting to hear back. They called her the next day. The director of the project was a woman named Dr. Albright, a sharp, energetic woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a deep, obvious love for her work. At the interview, Dr. Albright looked over Lena's resume, her finger pausing on Lena's last name. "Papadakis," she said, looking up over her reading glasses. "Are you by any chance related to Despina Papadakis?" Lena nodded. "She was my grandmother." A slow smile spread across Dr. Albright's face. "I co-authored a paper with your grandmother 15 years ago," she said, "on the hygienic behavior of her carniolan bees. She was one of the most brilliant, intuitive apiarists I have ever met. She had forgotten more about bees than most entomologists learn in a lifetime." She hired Lena on the spot. The work was a perfect fit. It wove together the two strands of her inheritance, the academic knowledge she had fought to acquire and the deep practical wisdom passed down from her grandmother. She spent her workdays surveying wildflower meadows, collecting specimens, and analyzing data under a microscope. The job not only provided a steady income, it rooted her professionally in the very landscape her family had called home for generations. Her supervisor respected her, not just for her degree, but for her name, for the legacy she represented. On her days off, Lena began the slow, deliberate work of resurrecting the apiary. She started small, just as Despina's letter had advised. She bought 2 nucleus colonies from a local breeder, small starter hives with a young, mated queen and a few frames of brood and honey. She spent a week carefully sanding and painting 2 sets of new hive bodies and supers, choosing a pale sky blue, the same color Despina had used. She placed the new hives at the edge of the field, in the same spot where the heart of her grandmother's apiary had once stood. Then she turned her attention to the land itself. The field that had once been a carefully managed source of forage was now a tangle of invasive thistle and burdock. Lena spent weeks clearing it by hand, section by section, her muscles burning, her hands stained with earth. She didn't use herbicides. Instead, she tilled the cleared soil and sowed a custom mix of seeds she'd ordered: wild bergamot, phacelia, crimson clover, and borage. She was not just planting flowers. She was rebuilding an ecosystem. She was setting the table for her bees. Watching the first green shoots emerge from the dark soil was a quiet thrill. Tending to the new hives was a return to a familiar liturgy: the scent of the smoker, the gentle heft of a frame heavy with nectar, the sight of the queen moving serenely across the comb, her abdomen elongated and regal. These were the rituals that centered her, that connected her to her past and her future. The project was not about producing honey to sell. It was about continuance. It was an act of faith, a promise to her grandmother that the work would go on. News travels fast in a small town. The sight of smoke rising from the chimney of the old Papadakis barn, the buzz of a rototiller in the overgrown field, the appearance of 2 new, brightly painted beehives, these things were noticed. Soon, people started to stop by. They came tentatively at first, as if not wanting to intrude, but drawn by curiosity and memory. An old man in a flannel shirt pulled up in a tractor, introducing himself as Mr. Gable. He had been a neighboring farmer for 60 years. He told Lena stories about her grandfather, Yanis, and how the 2 of them had helped each other raise their barns. He left a basket of fresh-picked sweet corn on her porch. A woman named Sophia, who owned the local diner, came by with a warm moussaka. She had been Despina's closest friend, and she embraced Lena with a fierce, motherly warmth, switching to rapid-fire Greek, her eyes full of tears. She told Lena that Despina had always spoken of her, always believed she would find her way back one day. A young couple who ran a nearby organic winery stopped in. They had heard that a Papadakis was keeping bees again and wanted to know if Lena would consider placing some hives in their vineyard the following spring. They spoke of her grandmother with a reverence usually reserved for saints. Each visitor brought a story, a memory, a piece of the past that they offered to Lena like a gift. They were not just being neighborly, they were validators. They were a chorus confirming that she belonged here, that her return was a restoration of the natural order of things. She was not an outsider, an escapee from the city. She was Despina Papadakis's granddaughter. She was home. It was a Saturday in late August, nearly a year after her arrival. The barn was fully restored, a quiet testament to a year of hard work. The wildflower meadow was in full, glorious bloom, a sea of purple, blue, and crimson, alive with the frantic, joyful hum of thousands of bees. Lena was sitting on the porch she had built, sketching the intricate anatomy of a bumblebee in her journal, when the sound of an unfamiliar engine made her look up. A low-slung, silver sports car, impossibly clean and utterly out of place, was making its way slowly up her gravel drive. It stopped, and Ryan Hollis got out. He was wearing a cream-colored linen suit, a pale blue shirt, and shoes that cost more than her monthly budget. He looked like he had stepped out of a magazine and into the wrong world. He stood for a moment by his car, looking not at her, but at the scene around him. He took in the restored barn, the gleaming roof, the vibrant meadow, the neat rows of hives that had expanded from 2 to 10. His face, usually a mask of confident composure, was a canvas of disbelief. He looked like a man who had discovered a continent he had been assured did not exist. "Lena," he said, his voice quiet. He walked toward her, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. I was in the area for a development deal. I thought I'd see—" He trailed off, his eyes still scanning everything, calculating, appraising. "I didn't know about this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the barn, the fields. The admission was flat, factual. "When we divided things, I wasn't thorough." It was the confession of a failed accountant, not a failed husband. He saw this place, this life she had built, as an asset he had overlooked, a column he had failed to add to his side of the ledger. He tried to find his footing, to regain control of the narrative. "It's incredible what you've done here," he said, the compliment sounding hollow, rehearsed. "You seem good." He took a step closer. "Lena, I've been thinking a lot this past year. About us. Maybe there's something that can be repaired." She looked at him, and for the first time she felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, not even a lingering sadness. She felt only a great, calm distance. She closed her sketchbook and set it aside. "You never asked, Ryan," she said. Her voice was even, without accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "In the 5 years we were together, you never once asked me about my grandmother. You never asked what she did for a living, or who she was, or what this place meant to our family." He had no response. The truth of her words was absolute, leaving no room for argument or excuse. He had never asked because he had never cared. He looked down at his perfect shoes, a faint flush rising on his neck. He was a man who always had an answer, a pitch, a solution. Now he was silent. "Is there anything—" he began, the question weak, a last desperate attempt. Lena met his gaze directly. "No," she said. It was not a word spoken in anger. It was gentle, clear, and final. "No, there isn't." He nodded once, a sharp, defeated gesture. He accepted it. He turned without another word, walked back to his gleaming, out-of-place car, and drove away, leaving behind nothing but a fading cloud of dust. That evening, Lena sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of cut hay from a neighboring farm and the rich, sweet perfume of goldenrod from her own meadow. The hum of the hives was quieting, a soft, contented murmur as the bees settled in for the night. She thought of Despina, a young widow standing on this same piece of land, facing a future that must have seemed as vast and empty as the winter sky. She thought of the quiet, unyielding strength it must have taken to not only survive, but to build, to create a life of such purpose and meaning from the ashes of loss. She thought of Ryan, driving back to his world of numbers and contracts, a world where everything had a price but nothing had any real worth. He had seen the barn today as a real estate asset, the land as a potential development. He was incapable of seeing it as a legacy, as a living repository of work and love. She understood now, with a clarity that was as pure and clean as strained honey, the true nature of her grandmother's gift. The money had been a tool, the barn had been a vessel. The real inheritance was the resilience encoded in her DNA, the quiet confidence that came from knowing how to build something real and lasting with her own 2 hands. Ryan had taken everything he could count. He had taken the numbers in the bank account, the thread count of the sheets, the documented value of their possessions. He had taken every single thing he could carry, itemize, and assign a price to. He had left behind the only thing that mattered. He forgot the old beekeeper's barn her grandmother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.